All right, Political Science 100, it's time to shift gears in the class now and take a look at the major institutions of American government, by which I mean the legislative, executive branches, including the executive bureaucracy, and the courts, the judicial branch. And I want to begin with just a thought or two on American political institutions in general. And I want to start by recalling the definition of politics, which is an agreement on the process for making and enforcing collective agreements. In other words, what our public policy is going to be, what our government's going to do, even as we disagree on what the outcome of those agreements ought to be. Here's some possible political processes for doing so. Dictatorship, in which a single person or a small cadre of people has all power and makes all the rules. A monarchy, in which some supposedly divinely ordained ruling entity has all the power. I prefer democracy, loosely defined as rule by the people, in which majority preferences are enacted. Whatever the most of the people want to do, that's what we do. With some limits, with some caveats that majorities don't have the right, at least in our democracy, to take away fundamental rights from minorities and to exercise undue power in inequitable ways over groups of people, concepts that we've talked about when we talked about civil liberties and civil rights. But generally speaking, absent those kinds of abuses of majority power, democracy means that the preferences of the majority are what become policy. With that in mind, consider just a few things off the top of my head that are the majority preferences in the United States. In terms of gun control, large majorities favor some kind of sensible gun control, and in particular, majorities favor universal background checks. In terms of immigration policy, a majority in this country favors some path to citizenship for those people who are here in the country currently illegally, some path to allow them to stay legally in the country. In terms of the influence of money in our politics, money in our elections, a majority believe that the wealthy have way too much influence over our political system. In terms of climate change, large majorities of Americans understand that climate change is real, it's actually happening, that humans play a role in it, and that government needs to act. Well, our political institutions, our supposedly representative institutions, have either enacted policies contrary to the popular will on each one of those things, or blocked policies that have carried out the people's will on those things, on every one of those issues I just mentioned. Whether or not you favor the majority views I just described on those policies, I think it's worth asking the question: are our institutions functioning in accordance with the agreed upon principles for deciding and enforcing collective institutions? Do we have effective political institutions now, if they are engaging in such counter-majoritarian decision making? So I'd like you to keep that in mind as we go through the discussion we're going to have over the next several sessions on political institutions. We're going to start with Congress. Congress is known as the people's institution. It is the only institution directly elected by the people. You'll recall that the Constitutional's original plan was for the House of Representatives to be directly elected by the people and the Senate to be indirectly selected by the state legislatures. We've amended the Constitution to allow, I believe it was in 1913, to allow the direct election of senators. So now Congress, the entirety of it, both houses, is elected directly by the people. And yet, despite the fact that we choose Congress, we tend not to think too highly of Congress. A survey done, it's about a decade old now, but the point remains, asked respondents, which do you have a higher opinion of, Congress or, and then gave them a number of choices. And you can see here some of the choices about which people have a higher opinion than Congress. Used car salesmen, cockroaches, root canals, Nickelback. That one's kind of funny. This survey is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. It was an actual survey. The Public Policy Polling is an actual survey firm. And it turns out that not everything is regarded more highly than Congress. Meth labs are not, for example. The Kardashians are not. Playground bullies are not, etc. But, so this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and yet this was a real survey, and these are the real responses. And more serious surveys, and we'll talk about some at the end of this discussion, have corroborated the low esteem with which most people hold Congress. I want to have you have that as sort of a background thought in your head as we go through first some basic information about Congress, and then we'll get to what I think is key to what we're seeing right here. Why do we have such a low opinion of Congress, despite the fact that we elect Congress? Some of the main themes in the textbook chapter on Congress are the requirements and the powers of Congress, the factors that advantage one or disadvantage one in congressional electoral politics, the actual makeup of Congress, some of the challenges, 6 of them to be specific, that Congress faces in terms of organizing and operating itself, the institutions that Congress has created and developed, evolved over time to help them deal with those organizational challenges. And then at the end, we'll come back to the question I just mentioned of public opinion in Congress. So the basic structure of Congress, as you know, is that we have a bicameral legislature. We have a House and a Senate. And this was the product of the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Small states advocated for equal representation, and large states wanted representation based on population because both of those things advantaged the states depending on their perspective. And so the compromise was to have both. So we have a House of Representatives with seats allocated by population and members elected directly by the Senate, by the citizenry, and sort of that advantages the larger states. States with larger populations have more representatives in Congress. The Senate has 2 members each from every state, so that advantages the small states. They have just as much influence on the Senate and Senate voting outcomes as the larger states do. So the whole idea was to split the difference in this divide of opinion that existed at the Constitutional Convention over the relative impact of small versus large states on Congress. In the House, members serve 2-year terms. And this itself was a compromise between the original proposal for annual elections that many people wanted and the idea of a 3-year term that James Madison preferred. And remember, and I mentioned this before in one of the first videos in this class, it's no accident that the chamber closest to the people, the institution of our government most directly connected to the people, has the shortest tenure in office. I think the founders hoped that any bad decisions we might make in installing who we installed in office could be quickly undone. The Senate, by contrast, is more insulated from the public mood. Senators serve 6-year terms, and again, as I mentioned, in 1913 we amended the Constitution with the 17th Amendment to directly elect members to the United States Senate rather than having state legislatures do so. And the point of the more insulated Senate is to really act as a counterweight or a buffer against the House. And so the founders explicitly did so in terms of the differences in the terms of the 2 offices. The founders clearly regarded the Senate as the more prestigious and more important of the 2 chambers in Congress. The Constitution gives Congress a lot of power over a lot of things. Congress was, in the founders' mind, to be the preeminent political institution of our government. It's covered in Article 1, the first article in the Constitution. So it's first in the Constitution. That article is by far the longest of the Constitution. It is the most detailed in terms of what Congress is supposed to do and what the role that the founders were looking for Congress to play. So Article 1, Section 8 sets out the enumerated powers of Congress, the things that they're allowed to do, the specific things. It also includes the necessary and proper clause that we spoke about earlier, that sort of blank check clause that says that any other powers besides the ones listed here, Congress has those powers too in order to do the things listed here. The Constitution requires that revenue bills involving taxing and spending, must originate in the House, but the Senate has the unrestricted right to amend them. Congress is also given a great deal of authority in foreign affairs. Congress declares war. Now you might just know that, but it's a little odd that we have a commander-in-chief, the president, who does not have also the power to declare war. Congress has the ability to raise and finance the military and call out state militias. Congress, the Senate in particular, is given the role of advising and consenting the president on appointments to the administrative branch and to the courts. And again, as I mentioned a second ago, the framers thought that the more aristocratic House of Congress, the Senate, it would insulate the 2 houses and keep a steadier eye, a more watchful eye, be more mindful of the nation's long-term interests than the House would be. A couple of choices that the founders made at the Constitution has had a big effect on electoral politics in Congress. The first is that members of Congress and the president are elected separately. That's such a simple sentence to say, but it's hard to overstate its importance. It means that the political fortunes of Congress are not directly tied to that of the president. That a ruling party in government doesn't entail both the president, the leader of the executive branch, and the legislature, a legislative majority. Meaning you can have, as we have right now, as I'm recording this, a Republican control in the House of Representatives and a Democratic president. You can have combined joint control of House and Senate by one party and a president from another party. And this has big effects on the ability of, on the policy making and the legislative process. The likelihood for success is much lower when you have divided government than you have unified government. And most legislatures in democracies throughout the world do not do that. Most legislatures have parliamentary systems wherein a majority party is either elected directly by the people or a majority coalition is formed after an election, and then from that majority party or coalition, a leader is chosen, usually called a prime minister, and they're of the same party. They're not elected separately. And so they either hang together or they fall apart together. There's much more unity in government and parliamentary systems than is the case in our system. Another important choice that the founders made was that members of Congress are elected from states and congressional districts, territorial areas wherein a single person represents a given chunk of territory, and that person wins that chunk of territory by winning a plurality of the votes in that area. Not necessarily a majority, just a plurality, more votes than anyone else. Most parliamentary systems use proportional representation, where the membership is assigned into the legislature, not based on allocations by territory, but in accordance with the proportion of the votes received. So if a party gets 40% of the vote, they'll get about that percentage of seats in the legislature. Another party might get 30% of the vote and 30% of the seats. And the representation is not connected to members who come from specific chunks of territory, of land. The importance of those two things will become even more clear when we get to the section on political parties. The two things I just said right there are why we have a two-party system in the United States. The founders didn't think long and hard about this. They weren't political scientists. They didn't understand the dynamics that are put into play when you have single-member district and plurality elections and what that does and how that creates a two-party system, but it does. So it was kind of an historical accident, the forces that were created that created a two-party system. Again, I'll get into that in much more detail in a little bit, in several days, when we talk about political parties. After the first census in 1790, each state was allotted one House seat for every 33,000 residents, for a total of 105 seats. As the country grew, and after each census, every 10 years, a census being an annual count of the population, the number of residents in the United States grew, and so the number of House seats grew. It grew until 1911, when Congress passed legislation limiting it, fixing it at 435, which is where we're at today. The idea was that if we kept growing, allowing the size of the House of Representatives to grow as the population grew, at some point you'd have 2,000 members of the House of Representatives, and the place would just become unwieldy. It would be too many people to possibly function as a legislature. So it was fixed at 435 in 1911. Not because there's something magical about 435, but just that was because that was where it was at the time that Congress decided to limit it. The size of each state's delegation can change after each census as the population shifts in the region and the state. And the text has a really good map that shows how the population has shifted lately in the country. And for the most part, the changes have been away from the north and the northeast and toward the south and the southwest. When the population shifts, then the representational boundaries need to shift as well. States that have lost population will lose seats in the House of Representatives because they have fewer people. States that have gained population will get some new seats as population shifts in their favor. So when the lines need to change, they have to be redrawn. I've mentioned this before in a previous video, but redrawing those lines is not a neutral act. When typically the states do it, and when a single party controls the entirety of state government, is a governor and controls the legislature, and has the ability to draw those lines, you tend to see some very interesting lines drawn in ways that advantage that party, the party in power. That is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the practice of drawing lines to favor a party's own candidates. And it tends to happen, as I said, when one party has the power to draw the lines and the state government that is doing the drawing is under the control of a single party. Gerrymandering has been challenged in court many times as being unfair in terms of representation. There have not been many, if any, successful challenges to gerrymandered districts. Just as I'm recording this today, the Supreme Court, and this is June 8th, 2023, the Supreme Court kicked back a set of districts drawn in Alabama, arguing that they were unfair to black voters in the state of Alabama. So that was a racial gerrymander that violated the constitutional requirements of equal protection under the law. That's one of the first and only challenges to gerrymandering that I can remember. Typically, the courts have not gotten involved, even though there have been some rather egregious gerrymanders, drawing of lines that are just ridiculous. The term gerrymandering itself comes about from the origin stands to a guy named Eldridge Gerry, who was one of the founders in the country and one of the first legislatures, and he drew some legislative districts that were drawn in such a weird and convoluted way it looked like a salamander. So hence the term gerrymandering. It refers to the crazy, non-contiguous parts reaching out, drawing of lines that are pretty obviously drawn for partisan favor. And yet, despite how obvious some of these moves are, the courts, like I said, have been pretty reluctant to step in and strike down those kinds of district drawing exercises. The text has a large table, and I'm only going to show you part of it here, but it reflects the genius, and if you're a Democrat, you'd call it the evil genius of the Republican Party's gerrymandering effort after the 2010 election. Every party has gerrymandered throughout the course of the history of the United States. Democrats have done it just as much as Republicans. But in 2010, the Republican Party took it to a new level. A level of genius if you're a Republican, and again, a level of evil genius if you're not. And after the 2010 election, the Republican Party basically used the most sophisticated map drawing software available with all kinds of data at the level of not just the districts that they're drawing, but at the street and housing level, data that made it pretty obvious what the residents in those areas' political preferences were to draw lines that advantage themselves. And this is kind of a confusing table, but I just want to point out one big thing to give you an example of how effective gerrymandering can be. So this column heading reflects Republican districts in which Republicans have an advantage. They have a registration advantage. There are more Republicans living there than Democrats. It's a Republican district. And this row represents states in which Republicans control the redistricting process after the 2010 census. This plus 16 means that in comparison to the number of seats that Republicans won in these exact same districts in the 2010 election, they won 123 in the 2010 election. They won 139 seats in 2012, just 2 years later, in the exact same districts comprised of almost completely the exact same people. That's a 16-seat advantage they drew for themselves because of their ability to effectively draw political boundaries that advantage them. If that makes sense to you, that's really the point of this table. And that's the power that gerrymandering has in advantaging one party and disadvantaging the other. And again, this is a very political act. You might think that congressional boundaries ought to follow some sort of logic, that ought to be as neutral as possible. But when you're the political party in control and you can draw lines that work in your favor, you're going to draw lines that work in your favor. And Republicans did it to great advantage after the 2010 census. We've been talking about House boundaries so far. Let's talk a little about Senate boundaries, which are states. So they're not gerrymandered. They're not redrawn every 10 years. But they vary tremendously in population. Of course, there are large states and there are big states. The senators from California represent about 37 million people each. Wyoming senators represent 564,000 people, so about 500,000 people. That's a pretty big discrepancy. And what it means is the people of Wyoming, on a sort of per capita basis, have much more influence in what the Senate does than the people of California do. Another way to look at this is to consider the 26 smallest states in the Union. Those 26 smallest states each have 2 senators apiece. That's 52 senators. That's a majority of the Senate right there. 52 out of the 100 come from the 26 smallest states. But those states comprise only 18% of the U.S. population. That's a big advantage, again, to the Republican Party, because Republicans tend to do better in small states. Small states tend to have fewer big cities. Republicans do better in rural areas and in suburbs, and Democrats do better in larger cities. So this is a political reality that works very much to the advantage of the Republican Party in modern state politics. And it's one of the imbalance of representation in the Senate, advantaging small states at the expense of large states, is one of the more counter-majoritarian aspects of American politics. Meaning, this is one of the reasons that our institutions of government, Congress in particular, often doesn't do what the majority wants. It's because there's a counter-majoritarian bias in the Senate built into it by virtue of the nature of representation and small states versus large states and their influence in the Senate. Let's talk about how Congress gets done what it's supposed to do. In the big picture sense, Congress is a solution to a collective action problem. The problem of coordination. We talked about how a nation of 333 million people can't possibly figure out things like healthcare or immigration or a pandemic response or anything else. There's no way that we could possibly handle those questions as a whole. There are too many of us. The problems are too big. So we delegate that to the 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. So Congress is itself a big solution to a massive collective action problem, the problem of coordinating the efforts of 330 million people. But Congress itself faces its own organizational problems, including problems of collective action. How does a body of 535 people acquire information? How does it coordinate its efforts? How does it resolve conflicts among the members in a way so that work can proceed? How do members work together for common goals as well as their own personal goals? That's a fundamental collective action problem in itself. How do they deal with the high transaction costs of doing all of the above? How does it cope with the time pressures that are inherent in a year session of Congress and a 2-year congressional term? Well, here's how it does those things. Congress has established its own institutions to help them do those things, to address all 6 of these issues. And the institutions that Congress has developed that I'm going to focus on include rules by which they operate, the reality of the party structure in Congress, and the development of the congressional committee system. So taking each of those in turn, the rules in Congress are basically accepted processes for how Congress is going to function. It's not necessarily ironclad, these rules, but they're basically accepted agreements in terms of how members will deal with each other and how certain decisions will be made. The party system reflects the fact that members of Congress are elected as members of one of the 2 major political parties, and so it connects them in Congress to teams that make cooperation between them more likely. And then the committee system is a system for dividing labor and to make it possible for Congress to get to its workload, given the realities of the necessity of acquiring information and dealing with conflict and doing so in a relatively quick time, in a way that they could never do it if they sat as a body of the whole and considered all the possible pieces of legislation that came before them. So taking each of those in turn, rules. As I said, rules are necessary to reduce conflict in Congress and to allow the institution to function fairly smoothly. A couple of examples of some rules. The position of committee chair is pretty important. We'll look at all the committees in Congress in a little bit, but each standing committee in Congress and the House and Senate has a chair. It's a pretty powerful position. It's a position, I've mentioned it before, has agenda control over what the committee is going to do. That's a big deal. There's a rule about who becomes the committee chair. It's the seniority rule. It's the senior member of the majority party. So right now the Republicans are in the majority in House of Representatives, so when the senior Republican serving on each of the committees, the various committees that I'll show you in just a second, that person is the chair. By having this rule, you eliminate the all-out infighting that would happen to become chair if there were no such rule. It's just understood and accepted that's how it goes. Another example, when speaking in Congress, the members on the floor address the speaker or the majority leader directly. That's why when you watch congressional speeches and a member rises to speak in Congress, the member will say, Madam Speaker or Mr. Speaker. They're addressing the speaker, even though they might be saying something really that's directed to or about another member of Congress. It makes it less argumentative. It makes it more agreeable and less confrontational operating that way. So that's just a rule about how they do things. They're not allowed. It's not that they're not allowed to turn and speak to a member of Congress, but to do so would violate a rule. And these rules exist again to reduce conflict and to let the body function more smoothly. The party structure in Congress is extremely important, and what it does is basically, members of Congress are elected as individuals. They're nominated by they become the nominees of one of the major parties, but they're elected as individuals. And so there would be, without some sort of organizing structure, the tendency to function as individuals. But that doesn't really do a whole lot as far as getting work done collectively. So the reality or the existence of the party structure connects and organizes members of Congress into teams, pre-existing teams that have a leadership structure. So a Democrat who is elected to Congress becomes part of the Democratic coalition in Congress, likewise a Republican. And in those coalitions, Republican and Democrat, there are structures in place of leadership. And the whole point of this leadership structure, and I'll show you the leadership structure now, as I record this, the Speaker of the House is Kevin McCarthy from California. The Republicans, again, have the majority in Congress for the time being, and they elected McCarthy as their overall leader, as the Speaker of the House. Here are the various Republican leaders on the House side. The House Majority Leader is Steve Scalise. There's a Majority Whip, Tom Emmer. Those are two pretty important positions. The role of these two men is to try and keep their team in line, keep them on the same page, voting together as a block in the same way on their position on pieces of legislation that come along. The whip in particular, it plays a role of going around and rallying up support for the party position on a given bill, particularly when that position might be favored by the party as a whole, as a nation, but might not be the popular position for specific members in certain parts of the country. So the job of the whip is to whip them into shape, not literally, of course, and as I'll get to in a second, not even figuratively, really. And then on the Democratic side, you see these same two positions. The Democratic leader is Hakeem Jeffries. The Democratic whip is Catherine Clark. There's some other positions as well. This isn't the entirety of the leadership structure, and of course the Senate has its own leadership structure. But the whole point is, there are teams in Congress that unify the otherwise individual members of Congress, and these teams have a leadership structure, and the whole point is to try and help the two parties coalesce around the same kinds of positions. It's to help address the collective action problems of coordination and information acquisition and working together as a whole rather than as a bunch of isolated individuals. So again, basically saying what I just said, congressional parties, the existence of a party structure in Congress helps form cohesive teams around specific policy positions and views, and it makes it more likely for the members of Congress to engage in collective action rather than to function as free agents. Without the leadership structure in Congress, members of Congress, organizing them would be like herding cats. And if you have cats, if you've ever dealt with cats, herding cats does not go well. That's what it would be like without some sort of unifying, cohesive structure, and that's what parties do. And so because of that, the party leaders are able to line up votes for and against legislation, pressure members to support their coalitions as best they can, and it helps reduce conflict. It helps They can broker agreements between members and settle disputes between members in a way that keeps the team more organized and makes it more likely that they will unify their efforts to pass legislation or to block legislation, depending on what they want to do. However, this works only imperfectly. Members of Congress are elected individually. Voters elect them, not the party leadership, not the party bosses. And in the current American political system, by current I mean over about the last 40, 50 years, our politics are highly candidate-centered, not party-centered. The parties used to play a much bigger role in selecting nominees for office and in getting them elected. Now, that's pretty much up to individuals, with parties playing a supporting role. Given the fact that the individuals elected to Congress don't owe their elections to the parties, they're only somewhat responsive to those parties. Their voters back home are the boss, not the party leaders. And so if push comes to shove between pleasing the voters back home, which will help get you reelected, or pleasing the party leaders, most of the time members of Congress will please the voters back home. So the parties have only limited control. They're not bosses in the historical sense of party bosses that really control, they're not puppeteers controlling the actions of individual members of the House and the Senate. Let's talk about the committee system. This is another key point in terms of organizing the workflow of Congress. Roughly 10,000 pieces of legislation per year come up before Congress. There's no way, and I believe I've said this in a previous video, there's no way that the House of Representatives as a whole or the Senate as a whole could all sit down in the chambers, the House and Senate chambers, and say, okay, let's take up bill number 1 and all talk about that at the same time. If they did it that way, they might get 100 bills down the list of 10,000. They certainly wouldn't get through all of them, but wouldn't even come close. In order to make the workload more efficient, they separate into subgroups. They divide up into committees, hence the congressional committee system. And the members are assigned to the committees that are relevant to the districts that they represent, so that they come from that area. The issue to which they're assigned, the committee that they're assigned, deals with issues that are of importance to that area. If you're a member of Congress from Iowa, you're probably going to get on an agricultural committee. And if you're a member of Congress representing the San Diego area, you might get assigned to a committee having to do with technology, given the importance of that industry in the San Diego, La Jolla areas, for example. So members will have some expertise in the area of the committee to which they're assigned. And this division of labor makes the system function more efficiently. Here's a look at the existing committee systems in the most recent Congress. And as you can see, so here's the House side and here's the Senate side. And I don't know how good your eyes are. Mine are old. But, so there's an Agriculture Committee, an Appropriations Committee, an Armed Services Committee, Budget, Education and Labor, and so on, Judiciary, Natural Resources, Rules, Science, Space and Technology, Small Business, Veterans Affairs, etc. Pretty much every major area of public life has a congressional committee assigned to it. And there are similar ones in the Senate. I'd also point out that in addition to the committees as a whole, there are a number of subcommittees that most of these committees break down into further divisions, subdivisions, to handle even more specialized areas of that general area. So the Appropriations Committee has 12 subcommittees in both the House and the Senate. The Agriculture Committee in the House has 6 subcommittees. There are 5 subcommittees to the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Commission. So the whole point is to not meet as a body of the whole to take up legislation. The whole point is to divide up into smaller groups and handle little chunks of it. And this plays into the next part about how Congress functions, and that is the legislative process. This is from your text. I'm not going to go through the entire how a bill becomes a law. I assume you know that. You've watched the Schoolhouse Rock video probably. Maybe that's a dated reference. Let me know if you've watched that video. But the point I want to make is in this overall process, so a bill is introduced, it's assigned to Congress, it works its way through Congress, it's voted on in the House and the Senate, the President signs it or doesn't. The point I want to make is right in here, when a bill is first introduced, the first place that bill goes is it's assigned to committees in the House and the Senate. And there are committees in both. The same bill has to go into both. And it gets, therefore, when it's assigned to the committees, it then gets assigned further down to subcommittees. most of those 10,000, give or take, plus or minus in depending on the year, most of those 10,000 pieces of legislation never escape this part right here. Most of those are killed in committee. Most bills die in committee. Very few ever come out and then are subjected to or have for very few of them is a vote on the full floor of the House and Senate ever held. Generally, they're killed in committee. So these committees, and the idea of a committee system overall plays a huge role in the efficiency of Congress, how Congress manages to get through its entire workload, given the time pressures they face. And also, they play a huge role in determining what does and what does not end up becoming law. And if we think about this from some of the standpoint of some of the collective active challenges that we talked about, so you can think of it as even committees having a collective action problem. They have to deal with a lot of information and a huge workload, and so they further their efficiency by having a committee chair. The chair, as I mentioned, is the member of the majority party, which has the most seniority, which again reflects to the twin towers of rules and party structure, which helps reduce conflict. And the chair organizes the work of the committee and usually has control over the agenda. So getting back to some concepts we talked about in the first part of this class, the delegation, power, the committee as a whole delegates a lot of power to the committee chairs. And one of the rules or one of the tools that committee chair has is agenda control. So those are two of the tools that are part of the design of our political institution to help further the functioning of our government institutions. This is a good time to take a break because I'm about to tell you a story about that power, the power of committee chairs, and about how congressional committees function, to illustrate a broader point about the ability of Congress to function as, let's say, not exactly a representative institution of American politics. So I'm going to quit here, take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll finish off the second half of Congress.